Okay, good morning everyone, and sorry for that rather surreal interlude. I've set fire alarms off before when I've started speaking, but never posed for formal photographs just before we start. I'm a bit like the warm-up act before the main bit, only not half as funny as the ones they get for the kind of star comedians. In all seriousness, this whole strategy, what you're going to hear about today, does sit within a certain context. And my role for this morning is to try and take you through that context. It is going to be the reduced Shakespeare version of what is a very big and very complex area of change that's happening at the moment. And it's change not just in relation to the legislation, but for any of you involved in the school system, you will know it's also change in terms of what's happening in schools, in terms of school funding, in terms of the curriculum, in terms of the whole role of local authorities and schools are all completely changing. And so it's really welcome, I think, that Essex has kind of responded to that in terms of taking this as an opportunity to really look at its whole SEN strategy and do that within this context of all this change. It is absolutely the right time for the authority to be refreshing what it's doing, and in doing that, anticipating some of these very, very major changes that are happening in the system at the moment. And I'm going to give you some of the nitty-gritty, and no apologies for that, in terms of what that change looks like and what's going to be required of the local authority as it goes forward. So I think it's really important to understand that when looking at the strategy. But I'm also just going to try and give you a little bit of a feel for why on earth is any of this happening? Why are we going through this change at the moment? And what is it the government is really trying to do as a result of that? Now, I'm not saying this is exactly what the system looks like in Essex at the moment. But for many people, and certainly for many parents, when I was doing my inquiry into SEN, they felt the system was not simple enough, that it was a maze, that you had to fight your way through it. There's all kind of typical comments that you would hear about parents, from parents about the system. And I was just trying to kind of encapsulate this in this cartoon here, in that unless you really knew what you were doing, you could feel that you really had to fight your way through the system to get what you wanted. And that was of nobody's choosing. I'm not particularly blaming the local authority or local authorities in general for that. But the system as itself had become incredibly complex. And I think if you talk to the people working in the system, they would say as much, that they felt it was too complex and restraining on them as the parents and young people themselves were as they were trying to go through. So we're trying to go from something like this, which is this incredible and complex maze of different ways of doing something, to something that, this is what my motorway looked like this morning, but you know, the idea that you have something simple and straightforward and you haven't got lots of roadblocks in the way, and if you're really lucky, the sun's beginning to come up and you can kind of not see the light at the end of the tunnel, certainly see the light at the end of a much clearer path to getting where you need to go as part of all of that. And then where legislation comes into all this, where policy comes into all of this, is how do you get from that to that for people? Well, it might be a little bit like this. And I don't know if you can all see it at the back. There's two math professors at a board with lots of kind of squiggles. And one says to the other, I think you need to be more explicit here in step 2. And step 2 is then a miracle occurs. And what the legislation is trying to do, and what this policy in a way is trying to do, if not bring about any miracles, then at least certainly get us from this situation where we had this awful maze that everybody had to negotiate into something with a much clearer pathway, a much clearer focus on what needs to change to make that happen. And when I started my inquiry, the real temptation when you look at all this stuff is to say, right, we're going to get rid of that set of rules in the maze and we're going to make people do everything by having a completely new and fresh set of rules, and if we just specify enough rules for people to follow, which essentially is what legislation is, especially by the time it comes down to local authority level, we'll get everybody to do the right thing this time. And the more and more, certainly I looked at it and everybody else that's looked at this, and this isn't a party political point, it cuts across both governments, the more I think everybody's become convinced that yes, of course you need some rules to the game, yes, of course you need some guidance for what the local authority should be doing, what schools should be doing. You need expectations around that in legislation, and you need some rights of redress where that all kind of goes wrong. But I think the real driver behind all of this, you can't really understand this new legislation unless you understand it's really trying to be about changing culture and about changing the culture of the way people go about doing all of this. And well, what does that look like? It looks like having a real change in the culture of expectations and outcomes for children with SEN. And this has been exemplified in the government's code of practice in terms of the whole system beginning to believe and start to really focus on having much better outcomes and indeed attainment for children with SEN, and actually maintaining a culture of high expectations. So it's not something you can set rules about easily, it's about changing that culture so that we have the same expectations of progress, of progression, of better attainment and better outcomes for all our children with SEN than we've had in the system until now. That was certainly what came out really forcefully from my inquiry. Again, it's what's come out of other people's inquiry that looked at bits of the system. Why? Because we still have a massive achievement gap for children with SEN and disability in this country. And I'm not talking about Essex here now. This is something that's universal across the whole of the country. I'm not going to read out all the figures, I simply haven't got time, but they're there for you to kind of absorb. It doesn't matter whether we look at early years, whether we look at Key Stage 1, whether we look at Key Stage 2 or Key Stage 4. At every stage there is still a very big and fundamental gap in the achievement and the outcomes that we are delivering as a country for children with SEN. And the real cultural change and the real focus of this legislation is actually to try and address that gap in expectations and improving outcomes for children with SEN. Now, I absolutely recognise that we are talking for children about progression, not about things like the floor standards at GCSE and A-level. But I think we are also talking about better attainment for many children. And I think it's been demonstrated where there's been a real focus in schools and a real culture of trying to get that attainment in schools, that that is also possible. What's also driving the reform, the other really big area of cultural change, is greater in parental involvement and choice. And again, just quoting from the draft code of practice, there is a real aim that parents have statutory rights to contribute to the decision-making process about their children's education, including in relation to assessments of SEN, provision for SEN, and what support is provided for SEN, and that young people are also brought into that conversation as well. And that's fundamentally about both consulting parents and bringing them into that process. And as I will talk about a little later on, there's actually some very hard-nosed theory behind that as well, in terms of achieving that first objective about getting those better outcomes for children. But how are we to do that? Well, it's not exactly like Homer Simpson, but what you do, how you achieve both of those is not by just putting more rules and regulations around that. It's about how you rearrange the furniture, if you like, in a way that makes it much more easier for everybody in the system to make the right decisions. So in my cartoon, I've got Homer, and they're trying to keep him off the donuts. So it's about putting the fruit nearer to Homer than the donuts. And this is all about that kind of, it's a joke on that whole idea of how you kind of nudge people towards better decisions in life. I'm not for a minute saying Essex County Council is Homer Simpson. Don't quote me on that, maybe. But what I am saying is that it is part of this effort that rather than having 10 more rules and regulations about Homer not eating the donuts, which isn't going to make any difference at all, what you've got to do is make the whole system easier for everyone, so that schools, so that local authorities, so that parents are always in a better position to be able to have the conversations they need to be able to make the right decisions they need about what's going to happen. And when you see the legislation that I'm now going to trot through, I want you to keep that in mind, that this isn't about just creating a new set of rules and regulations for everyone to follow. So we know what happens when we do that. We've tried that for 30, 40 years in this country around SEN. I was one of the people that helped write some of the last set of rules even. And, you know, as I said, they're valuable to guide, they're valuable about setting direction. People must have some legal rights in the system. but it's really about how all of us in this room together can work to deliver that better system within this kind of new framework. So, what are the different elements that are going to bring around that changing culture, bring around that focus on outcomes? Fundamentally, I think the government are doing something very interesting, introducing this concept of the local offer, which many of you will have heard of by now. And this is what the government minister said about it way back in January. The local offer would enable families to see readily what they can expect from mainstream services across education, health and social care, how to access more specialist support, how decisions are made, including eligibility criteria for accessing services, and where appropriate, how to complain and appeal. Local authorities will be required to involve children, young people and families in developing their local offer to take account of their needs and aspirations. So this isn't about a better information directory of services, useful though that would be. It isn't simply just about being much clearer about who gets what and why, great though that would be as well. But fundamentally, this is about that culture change. It's about saying what goes on within the local authority, what goes on within the school has to be done as a conversation with parents and involving parents in that. And if we can get that right and get that trust in the system because parents are fully involved in it, you will get a better system, you will get better outcomes, you will get better service outcomes because you will understand better what's really going to help those children and young people by involving parents who know most about them at that stage in the delivery of that service and that education. So the government are legislating, they are saying that every local authority has to have a local offer, but the purpose of that is to dramatically improve the engagement and involvement of parents in their children's education, in what's available, making sure that what the authority and schools are providing is fundamentally right in terms of delivering those better outcomes for children. So it's a kind of fundamental change in terms of making provision more responsive to local needs and about providing a clear and comprehensive and accessible information about the support and opportunities then that are available. So you need both. And then hopefully that becomes a really virtuous feedback loop where as the local authority has the conversations, the services improve and become more relevant for the parents. And so actually you get a spiral in which services are improved and parental confidence is improved around what's happening with those services. So a fundamental change, but a fundamental change not to put 20 more rules around what's going to happen, but actually to try and engender a completely different way of working at local level. And not just in relation to how the local authority does the strategy, but also there's a whole element of this which is looking at how the schools would also respond and have their offer for families as well. So it needs to set out what families can expect from local services, what services are available to support not just education, health and care plans, but also all those other services in schools, and what specialist support is available to help parents, young people and children as they go through that system. So it's about making sure the provision is right to deliver those better outcomes. And making sure that as part of that, and fundamentally it still remains very important, that the education, health and care provision for children and young people should include information about its quality and about the outcomes achieved for those that use it. So it's not just enough anymore to say, well, we put some provision in place. The judgment on whether that provision was the right provision and how it's done will be on the outcomes achieved. And that's what links together what I was talking about earlier in terms of the whole system driving towards those better outcomes that we talked about. And ideally, what you might end up with as a result of that, and this is just somebody's, again, sorry at the back, you may not be able to see this so clearly, but it's going back to my transport analogy. For some reason I'm hooked on transport at the moment. But essentially this is a local offer that's been produced by one of the Pathfinder authorities. And this is their way of then putting it together in a way that they hope will be simpler and more obvious for parents. And the different tube lines, the green, the blue and the red, are education, health and social care. And those are the different bits. The stops are the different bits they have to produce along the way. Don't worry about what it looks like. The point is that it's trying to take the maze and turn it into something simple and straightforward where you know where you're going for your different services. And that's the ultimate aim of the local offer. You start to get that clarity on all sides about what people are trying to do and the way they're trying to do it. There are some other major changes happening within the system, and I will be coming to education, health and care plans which are replacing statements. But first, I think it's also really important to understand the way this is changing at the schools level. So, School Action Plus, which as we know are the two main categories that schools have tended to use to identify children with SEN, are going. That doesn't mean SEN goes, it doesn't mean the children suddenly miraculously change with their needs in some way. But what it does mean is that, again, the government is saying that actually, rather than put children into categories, what we need to do is look at each individual child and their personal needs and address those, in this sense, in the same way as we would any other child. And that actually, this whole kind of paraphernalia of School Action Plus, putting children into categories, is not the right way. And there's a lot of thinking behind that. Certainly in my inquiry, I was very concerned that schools tended to focus the best teachers on those children with the highest abilities, but that we also need the best teachers and better targeted resources on those most in need. And in a way, by removing School Action Plus, what the government is saying is that every child with SEN is the responsibility of the teacher in that class, first and foremost. Yes, learning support assistants are really important, but it's the teacher that has to own SEN within their classroom and own all the children with SEN as part of their school offer for all children. And so what it's saying is that instead of School Action Plus, there should be a graduated response to all children with SEN in terms of ensuring that parents and children are fully engaged and consulted, that child and young person is fully engaged and consulted, and then there should be a plan which focuses on what outcomes are expected and the support the school and the college and any relevant agencies may provide. So that theme of involvement is followed through into the way the school should be working with parents and young people, but then also that an individual plan for each individual child is made about what their SEN need is and then how that's actually going to be addressed. And the way the government have described this in the draft code of practice at the moment, and that's still going to, is under consultation, but I don't think the process is going to change. I think it may become even more detailed about what this looks like. But essentially then, what schools have to do is working with the teacher and the SENCO, establish if there's an SEN need, link to the progress and attainment measured against their peers, and the views of parents and the child are taken into account, and then provision is made and that's reviewed against further progress, and involvement of specialist support services are brought in as and when that particular child needs it, against a personalised plan for that individual child. So no more School Action children, no more School Action Plus children, but a personalised plan for each individual child as they go through the school when they're identified as having an SEN need. In short, this is what really good schools do already in terms of quality first teaching. And so for educationalists in the room, I know if you're all kind of going, yeah, I know what this is, it's quality first teaching, this is what we do. Absolutely right. It's exactly what the government is trying to drive through the system. That same quality first teaching that's applied to any other child is fully applied to children with SEN. Yes, they may need additional support, but actually what we're doing here is saying that we treat, in some senses, that child as everybody else in terms of our expectations about what's needed, and then we put in the additional support to make sure that child can meet the objectives and outcomes and attainment that we think is possible for that individual child. And that's what the school is looking at. So in relation to that, I talked about there being a local offer which the local authority drives, a set of strategic discussions. At the school level, that is translated into a school offer with requirements around what a school must look to doing. And essentially, schools have to provide information to parents around how the school identifies, assesses and provides for pupils with SEN, how the school assesses the progress, the name and details of the contact of the SEN coordinator, the expertise and training of staff to deal with that, the equipment, facilities and support that children need, and the role played by pupils with special educational needs in all of that. Now again, some of you from schools will be going, yes, got that, that's not so different from what we currently have to do around our SEN policies. And you would be absolutely right, but what it does ask is for you to do them at more of a level of detail than perhaps you might have done in the SEN policy before. And for me, what's fundamental about this is that for a school to be able to provide this information for parents, that school will have had to have thought through all those processes in terms of what is its offer for parents and for children in that particular school. And that's what's fundamental. Before you can even answer the question, therefore, what am I going to give the parents, you've got to know what you are doing around all of that to be able to do it. So for me, it's a fantastic checklist of how schools should be thinking through what their offer is going to be around SEN at that point before, and indeed even after that point when education, health and care plan is triggered. 2 seconds very quickly on why this stress all the way through both the local offer more generally and at the level of schools about parental involvement. You would expect for someone that was asked to look into parental involvement and confidence in SEN, I would say it's a good idea. Obviously I think it is. But actually, even if you're not convinced on any other grounds, all the academic evidence in this country and from abroad says that the greater involvement of parents, especially at the level of good home school involvement, increases attainment and increases outcomes for children with SEN. That is obviously a fundamental good in its own right. It's important. It's the way we're trying to address this issue of outcomes in the system. It also happily allows you to better fulfil your Ofsted obligations when they come and inspect you, because Ofsted are going to be measuring against progression in the future. So there's some very good reasons why parental involvement should happen, and if you're on the side of the angels, probably everybody in this room is this morning, you will already be doing that. But if your school is struggling with that, it's another good incentive to think about how we're going to address the issue relating to SEN, because actually parental involvement is going to help you get those outcomes and better attainment for those children. Education, health and care plan is a very big area of the reforms, and probably in terms of what people will have heard about most, it is the signature change, if you like. So at the moment we have statements which relate only to education, and they only relate to a certain time period. What the government is doing is introducing something called an education, health and care plan. That plan will apply from birth through to 25 years of age, and it does introduce new duties on health and social care to cooperate in the production of a plan. This is for children that have more additional needs that the school hasn't been able to cope with, will trigger the consideration of producing this plan. Government have introduced a new duty to jointly commission the services that are there as part of a plan. So this is a very important change in terms of the responsibilities of different agencies to cooperate together. So one of the rules they have put in place is this general requirement that education, health and care, when a plan has been issued, have to work together to produce that plan and then jointly to commission the services as a result of that plan. And again, it's about getting away from the maze I showed at the beginning, where the parent is running around trying to navigate their way through it, to one in which the statutory authorities take on the responsibility of making sure they're coordinated and that the offer they're giving back to the parent and the young person is a coordinated offer with choices in it about what might happen next. What isn't changing is the criteria the government is saying for triggering a plan remains the same. It has shortened the timescales to 20 weeks from 26, so it has to be done quicker. And it's also saying that other agencies in the future can trigger a plan. So, for example, if a family doctor thinks there needs to be a plan for a child, that family doctor can go to the local authority and say, I think this child is in need of a plan. So it's not just triggered by educationalists, but the plan is still an education, health and care plan. So the legal duty to issue a plan is triggered by there being a special educational need, and that triggers the health and social care involvement. If there is no special educational need, if there's just, say, a disability or social issue within the family, that then does not trigger the requirement to have an education, health and care plan. And that's an important distinction around this. Doesn't mean that the person therefore shouldn't still get the health or the social care that they were getting, but the requirement to do all this comes about because it's an education, health and care plan. And we don't know for sure yet, but it looks like local authorities will be given up to 3 years to transfer existing statements into EHC plans. But from September 2014, new people coming into the system, the government would expect that they will get an education, health and care plan. I've talked about the joint commissioning duty, which I think is very important, one of the most significant changes. The other is obviously that it now applies from birth through to 25. So some responsibilities remain post-19 now, and also under the old system, statement stopped at 16, this now goes all the way through. So you don't get the thing that parents used to often complain about, which was children falling off a cliff age 16 when they shifted to a completely different system. And so that's the other kind of fundamental change that's happening in this area. There's a lot of talk and concern about how all this gets funded and where the funding comes from. I take my life in my hands at this bit because it's where people get ever so excited about the technicalities. But essentially this is straight out of the government's draft code of practice. And once you have an education, health and care plan, there are essentially 4 areas this can and should be funded from. 3 are statutory, 1 is more voluntary. So once somebody has an education, health and care plan, funding can come from both the high needs funding block within the local authority. It can also come from health, it can also come from social care. And indeed the government has increased the responsibilities on health and is still looking, according to the Minister only this week, at how far they want to put additional obligations on social care. But essentially, the plan is still a statutory plan for the education part. So if a parent is still unhappy about something, they can go to education tribunal about that. There are new responsibilities on health. If health says something is in that plan, then health has to provide, and if not, the parent can go up the health complaints route. The government's still looking at social care and how they can bring that more tightly into that orbit as well. But essentially, within that, there are then 3 forms of statutory funding, which is the health, the education, and social care. But schools can also feed into that funding if they want. And interestingly, part of that funding can be taken as a personal budget or direct payment by the parents themselves as well. So that's one of the other fundamental changes that happens in this. This is about bringing the principle of more choice and personalisation again into the education, health and care plan. And running all the way through that again is the requirement to consult with the parent and young person at each stage in the process. I mentioned very quickly post-16, and I think this is the other area where there have been some very important changes. Local authorities must involve post-16 institutions when reviewing their special education provision and developing their local offer. So there's be a local offer for post-16. You can now name an institution in the education, health and care plan post-16 in a way that you couldn't before. So that offers choice, again, with the agreement of the local authority to the parent and by now really the young person in terms of where they go, and express a preference for that in the same way as you can express a preference pre-16 before. And part of the local offer will be done as a kind of consultation with schools and colleges about how young people would like to be placed with them, and they will also have a copy of their education, health and care plan, and will work to that now rather than the system that existed before. And indeed, there is some extension of rights to education post-19 that the local authority has to look at whether the person's managed to complete their education by 19 or not. Very quickly, what's not changing is the definition stays the same. The admission code stays the same and applies to academies and free schools. The general principle of inclusion in mainstream has been maintained. And the SENCO must be a qualified teacher has also been maintained. And the government is saying that the plan contains the same legal protections around education as in the statement. So, to kind of summarise, and I did promise you that was a very quick reduced Shakespeare version of what's a very complicated set of changes in legislation. But I would urge you today, and I know that the strategy does this very well in terms of really keeping a focus on the fact that this is all about children and young adults with SEN have better attainments and better outcomes. It's great getting the provision, but we want to see that that has an impact. That parents end up with more confidence in the system, and that, as we know, the limited resources that local authorities have got now and that schools have got get used in the right places with cooperation between agencies and this rather fancy word co-production with parents. And if we can achieve all of that we will end up, I really believe, with a much better system that really serves children and young people with SEN and their parents much, much better. Thank you very much for listening to that, and I hope we haven't left you feeling like this.